On the morning of March 19th, 1999, anybody driving the county road through Bellamy Hollow could see that something was wrong with sugaring season. The weather had gone warm and stayed warm, 11 days running, and the sugar shacks that should have been rolling steam from every hillside stood cold and quiet. No smoke above the Fontaine place. Nothing over the co-op's demonstration stand by the school. Down at the Corbeau Creamery Co-op, men leaned against the loading dock in shirt sleeves in March in Vermont and talked about the season in the past tense. The whole county seemed to have banked its fires at once and agreed not to mention it, except that anybody who looked up from the road toward the high shoulder of land behind the Deschamps dairy barn could see one thin column of wood smoke rising off the north slope, steady as a plumb line, where a 17-year-old girl the whole valley had spent a year and a half laughing at was boiling sap at 7 in the morning like the season had never ended. Her name was Nora Deschamps. And to understand how she came to be the only fire lit in Corbeau County, you have to go back a year and a half, to the fall afternoon she first backed her father's rust-eaten flatbed up to Orville Stack's equipment shed and started loading his old sap buckets like they were worth something. They were not worth something. Everybody in the hollow agreed on that point, and the hollow did not agree on much. Galvanized buckets gone orange with rust, lids bent or missing entirely, spouts seized solid in coffee cans of hardened grease. Most farms in the valley had a pile like it rotting in a shed corner, left over from the days when half the county still sugared in the spring, and most farmers were glad to see the pile go. Orville stood in his doorway and watched her load 91 buckets by herself, one armful at a time, and never lifted a finger to help. He was not an unkind man. He simply saw no reason to participate in foolishness. When she thanked him, he told her she'd saved him a trip to the scrap man. And for a long while that stood as the kindest thing anybody in Bellamy Hollow said about the whole undertaking. She went to the Fontaine farm next, then the Petit place, then 4 more before the snow flew. She took buckets, bent spouts, a cracked gathering tank, and a wooden sap sled with one runner sprung. At the Petit place, old Mrs. Petit came out to the shed in her barn coat, watched the girl work for a while, and then went back into the house and returned with something wrapped in a dish towel. It was a sap hydrometer in a dented brass cup, her late husband's, for testing the density of boiling syrup. She pressed it into Nora's hands and said only, "He'd rather it worked than sat." By Christmas of 1997, Nora had 217 buckets stacked floor to rafter in the old sugar shack on her family's north slope, a building nobody had lit a fire in for 17 years. Her older brother Luke finally asked her straight out, over evening milking, what exactly she thought she was doing. She wiped her hands on her coat and said, "Putting things back where they belong." He waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. If stories like this one are your kind of thing, stories about stubborn people, forgotten land, and skills that almost slipped away, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss the ones still coming. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. These little hollows travel farther than anybody in them would ever believe. Bellamy Hollow sat in the folded hills of Corbeau County, Vermont, 2 ridgelines away from anything a map would bother to name. It was dairy country, or what was left of dairy country by the late 90s, which is to say, it was a valley slowly learning to say goodbye. The farms that had survived the 80s had done it by getting bigger or by getting stubborn. And there was no question which road the Deschamps farm had taken. 62 acres, 41 milking cows, a barn roof patched in 3 different colors of steel, each color marking a year the family could afford exactly enough metal to stop one leak. Nora's father Remy ran the herd with Luke, up at 4:30 every morning of his life, and carried the kind of quiet, permanent tiredness that a decade of falling milk checks presses into a man until it becomes his posture. Her mother Claudine kept the books at the kitchen table on Thursday nights. And the family had learned to read the state of those books from the set of her shoulders without anyone saying a number out loud. That fall the numbers were bad in a new way. The milk check had dropped twice since summer. The tractor needed a clutch. In November, Claudine drove to town and came back with a part-time job at the school cafeteria. and nobody at the table said a word about it, which was how the Deschamps family said everything. Nora was the younger of the two kids, and the one nobody worried about, which in a small place is its own kind of invisibility. She did her barn chores before school and after, kept her grades parked in the safe middle of her class, and spent more time in the farm's backwoods than anyone could account for. She wasn't dreamy about it. Dreamy kids drift, and Nora did not drift. She was the sort of person who wanted to know why a thing worked and would stand in front of it, however long it took, until she did. When the vacuum pump in the milk house developed a stutter, it was Nora, 13 years old, who traced it to a check valve while the dealer's man was still writing up an estimate. The teachers at the county school called her quiet. The truth sat closer to patient. And patience in a 16-year-old is the easiest thing in the world to mistake for having nothing to say. The backwoods were the reason for everything that followed, though nobody knew it yet, including her. Behind the barn, the land climbed north and kept climbing, 40-some acres of it, up into a stand of sugar maples that her great-grandfather had thinned and tended and tapped from the 20s clean through to 1980, the year her grandfather Emile died, and the family's sugaring stopped like a clock. Nobody thought to rewind. The shack was still up there, gray and sway-backed, with a cupola like a little church steeple gone to moss. The evaporator was still in it, a long flat pan rig under a drift of dust and mouse nests, its firebox door hanging open like something interrupted mid-sentence. The woods had gone shaggy around the old sled roads, and saplings crowded the edges. But the trees themselves had spent 17 years doing what sugar maples do when people stop paying attention to them. They had kept growing. Some of the veterans along the North Line were pushing 2 feet through the middle now, crowns locked together 100 feet up. And on still October days, the whole slope turned a shade of orange that made people slow their trucks on the county road, without quite knowing why. What lit the fuse was a tin box. Nora found it on a rainy afternoon in August of 1997, wedged behind the evaporator's firebox door where she had ducked in out of the weather, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, was her grandfather's sugaring ledger, water-stained, smelling of smoke and pencil shavings. Every season from 1946 to 1980, written out in a cramped, careful hand, tap counts and boil dates and gallons finished, with margin notes scattered through it, half of them in French. Little verdicts on weather and wood and neighbors. She sat on the arch rail and read it while the rain worked on the roof. And on a page from March of 1978, she found a line entered in pencil and underlined twice, the only underlined line in 34 years of records. North Line ran 9 days after the Petit Place quit. Slope is worth more than sugar content. She read it 4 or 5 times. She did not fully understand it. She understood that it was the kind of sentence a careful man underlines only when he has proved it to himself and wants somebody after him to know. She copied it into a notebook of her own that same night, a battered spiral thing that would fill up over the next 2 years with sketches and tap counts and mistakes. And then she went looking for the one person left in Corbeau County who might be able to read her grandfather's ledger the way it had been written. Alcide Rousseau was 81 years old and lived alone at the end of a dirt lane with a woodpile squared away like masonry and a dooryard swept like a kitchen. For 5 decades, he had boiled sap for hire on 9 different farms across the county. Back in the days when a good sugar maker was a man you booked a year ahead and bragged about landing. His name was still spoken at the co-op with a particular tone. The tone reserved for men who had been the best at something the valley no longer did. What had ended it was his hands. A tremor had come into them in his 70s. Small at first, then not small, until a man who had drawn off 10,000 gallons of syrup by eye could no longer carry a full scoop across a shack without wearing half of it. He answered the door, looked at the girl on his step, looked at the ledger she held out, and said nothing at all for a moment. Then he took it, went inside, and left the door open behind him, which from Alcidi Rousseau was a written invitation. He turned pages for the better part of an hour, while she sat across the kitchen table, not daring to speak. Finally, he laid his palm flat on the open book, the tremor moving through it like weather, and said, "I helped Emile hang half these buckets. That was the whole negotiation. He never once called what followed teaching. He called it keeping her from wrecking her grandfather's trees. And he charged her nothing for it but rides up to the shack and the occasional jar of Claudine's pickles. The first thing he made her learn had nothing to do with buckets, or pans, or fire. It was the trees themselves. And why sap moves at all? Because in Alcidi's settled opinion, 90% of failed sugaring came from people who treated a maple like a faucet god installed for their convenience. A sugar maple spends its whole summer banking starch in the living wood of its trunk, he told her, laying it away the way a careful family lays away money. In late winter, when the nights drop hard below freezing and the days climb above it, that starch turns to sugar, and the freeze and thaw work the tree like a hand pump. The night's freeze pulls water up from the roots and locks pressure into the stem. The day's thaw releases it, and the sap pushes out any wound it can find. A broken twig, a squirrel bite, or a tap hole somebody drilled on purpose. No freeze, no pull, no thaw, no push. The entire season lives inside that swing of a few degrees on either side of 32, he said. And a sugarmaker's real crop was never syrup at all. It was cold nights. Nora wrote that down word for word and drew a line under it, the way her grandfather would have. The mockery, when it came, started at the Corbeau Creamery Co-op, the way most things in Bellamy Hollow started. Somebody had seen the loaded flatbed going by. Somebody else had heard about the wall of rusted buckets stacked in a dead man's sugar shack. By the time the story had made 3 circuits of the loading dock, it had acquired a name, Nora's Junk Run. And the word that stuck to it, the one that followed her through the feed aisle and the school hallway both, was junk. Orville Stack, holding court by the milk scale one Saturday, said somebody ought to have saved the girl the trouble and called the scrap man direct and got his laugh. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was the settled voice of a valley that had watched sugaring die once already, had sold its own buckets or let them rust, and did not care to watch a child conduct a séance over it. Even her own father, who had signed off on the project mostly because it cost him nothing but a daughter's spare hours, stood with her in the barn one December evening and told her, gently, not to get her heart set on woods that hadn't earned the family $1 since before she was born. Nora didn't argue with him. She had noticed, reading the ledger, that her grandfather never seemed to argue with anybody. He just wrote down what happened, season after season, until the record argued for him. Then, in the first week of January 1998, the woods got a price tag, and everything quietly became more serious. A man named Dale Perriot, of Perriot Land and Timber over in the next county, drove up the Deschamps Lane in a clean white pickup and walked the north slope for 2 hours with a diameter tape and a can of blue marking paint. He was polite enough to leave in the truck. Veneer-grade sugar maple, he explained at the kitchen table afterward, was bringing money that would have sounded made up 10 years ago. Big, straight, clear-trunked trees like the veterans on that slope went to mills that sliced them thin as paper for furniture faces, and buyers could not get enough of them. He had done his arithmetic on a notepad in the truck, and he slid it across the table with the good manners of a man who knows his number will do the talking. For a select cut of the North Line, the biggest and best of it, Perriot Land and Timber would pay the Deschamps family $23,400. Remy read the number twice. It was more than the milk check brought in some entire years. It was a new clutch, the banknote caught up, the roof done in one color of steel. Claudine looked at the notepad and then at her husband, and neither of them looked at Nora, which was how she knew they were thinking about it. Her father told Perriot they'd want to sit with it a while. Perriot said the offer was good until the following winter, shook hands all around, and left a business card on the table, square in the middle, like a stone marking something. Nobody in the family said the obvious thing out loud, so the obvious thing moved into the house and lived with them. The trees Perriot wanted, the tall, clear, 2-foot veterans crowning the North Line, were the exact trees Emile's ledger prized, the deep woods giants that carried the family's sugaring for 34 years. You could log them or you could tap them. There was no arrangement of words in which you did both. And a select cut, Alcidi told her flatly when she brought him the news, does not just take trees, it takes the roof. open holes in a closed canopy, and the sun pours onto snow that used to lie in blue shade until April. The slope warms. The freeze quits early. Whatever it was her grandfather had underlined in 1978 would go out of those woods on the back of a log truck, and no check would buy it back inside of 80 years. He said all this without raising his voice. And then he said the sentence she wrote inside the front cover of her notebook that night, where she would see it every day for the rest of this story. Trees don't quit on people, he said. People quit on trees. So the winter of 1998 became a quiet race that only two people in the valley knew was being run. On the surface, a girl was scrubbing rusted buckets. Underneath, she was trying to prove, in one season, on borrowed knowledge, with a shaking-handed old man for a crew, that a hillside was worth more alive than sod, before her family's arithmetic settled the question the other way. Every bucket got scrubbed, scalded, and set upside down to dry on racks she built from pallet wood. Alcidi showed her how to true the bent lids with a rubber mallet and a stump, which spouts were worth saving, and which would bleed a season away one drip at a time. And how to read the hydrometer Mrs. Petit had given her, the brass cup filled with boiling syrup, and the stem floating at the red line when the density came right. Under his eye, she walked the north line on snowshoes with a diameter tape and lumber chalk, because the second law he gave her was as hard as the first. The tree pays for everything, he said, so you don't overdraw the account. Nothing under 10 inches through the middle gets tapped at all. A 10-inch tree carries one tap and one tap only. A big veteran of 18 inches or better might carry 2, never 3. And the hole itself is a wound, drilled barely an inch and a half deep, angled a touch upward so it drains, and moved to fresh wood every season so the tree can close last year's hole behind you. Tap greedy, he said, and you'll get one loud year and a hillside of sick maples. Tap right, and your granddaughter's granddaughter is still boiling. She chalked 183 trees fit to carry a bucket, wrote every one of them into the notebook by size and location, and left more standing unmarked than she marked, including, on Alcidi's orders, a dozen of the very giants Dale Perrot had measured with different arithmetic in mind. By late February of 1998, the racks were full, the spouts were sorted. 4 cords of her own splitting stood drying in the shack, and a 16-year-old girl was lying awake at night, listening to the weather the way other people listen for a phone to ring. She had the buckets, she had the trees, she had a dead man's ledger and a living man's hands, one of them steady. What she did not have yet was any idea how much a first season could go wrong. Her first season, the spring of 1998, she ran 61 taps, and only 61 because Alcidi flatly refused to let her hang more. A first year is for making your mistakes small, he said, and she made them anyway, every one of them, right on schedule. The last week of February arrived wearing a soft, lying warmth, 3 days of it, and Nora, certain the season was starting without her, drilled her taps 9 days too early. Then winter came back and sat down. By the time the true runs began in mid-March, the walls of those first holes had half dried, the way an open wound skins over, and trees that should have run hard gave her a stingy drip. Alcide did not console her. He stood in the snow, looked at the buckets and said, "Now you know what February is." 2 weeks later, she scorched a pan. It happened at 2 in the morning, at the end of her 3rd straight night of boiling after full days of school and barn, when she misjudged the fire and the liquor level in the same 10 minutes, and the shallow inch of Amsot's syrup over the flues went black. The smell of burnt sugar hung in her coat for a week, along with the arithmetic, which she did without being asked. $40-odd of syrup, cooked to tar, because she had wanted to finish one more draw before sleeping. And in the last days of the month, a warm rain slid the whole snow load off the shack roof at once and buried her drying woodpile, so that she finished the season burning half-wet ash that hissed at her like it held an opinion. She drew her last pull on April 2nd and bottled 14 gallons and a quart, 5 months of work. The co-op doc did that arithmetic too out loud and enjoyed it more than she had. 61 taps, 14 gallons, and a burnt pan. Somebody totted up by the milk scale. Girls paying the valley to laugh at her. What the doc never saw was the other page of the ledger. 14 gallons had buyers before April was out, at $31 a gallon at the farm stand, sold on nothing but a hand-lettered sign and the novelty of the name Deschamps on a syrup jug again after 17 years. More than one gray-haired customer held the jug a moment longer than the transaction required. And every mistake of that first spring had been written into the spiral notebook in plain sentences next to its cause, the way Emile would have done it. Tapped too early on false thaw, fired too hard while drawing, woodpile sighted under the slide path of the roof. When Alcidi read the burnt pan entry, he tapped the page twice with a shaking finger and delivered his verdict. "Good," he said. "Cheap year for that lesson." The summer and fall of 1998 would have looked, to anyone watching from the road, like a girl doing chores in the woods. It was closer to an apprenticeship in economics. She limbed the deadfall out of the north line and reopened the old sled roads so the tractor could walk a gathering tank up the slope instead of her spine carrying it. She split and stacked 6 full cords of hardwood and stacked them uphill of the shack this time, under their own roof of salvaged steel, because Alcidi's arithmetic on fuel was merciless, and he made her learn it cold. "Sap runs about 40-1, he said. 40 gallons hauled, lifted, and boiled away for every single gallon of syrup you finish, which means a season is mostly the removing of water, and water does not remove itself. On an old flat pan rig like Emile's, you feed close to a full cord of dry wood for every 20 or 25 gallons of finished syrup. That is the tax the evaporator charges. Every year, no appeals, and green or wet wood is how fools pay the tax double." She patched the pan's seams with solder, rebuilt the crumbling firebrick in the arch, and learned to run a boil the way he insisted it be run, shallow and hard, barely an inch of liquid dancing over the flues, drawing off in small pulls when the syrup came right. The hydrometer told her when, the brass cup filled and the stem riding at the red line. But Alcide made her learn the older test alongside it, syrup sheeting off the edge of the scoop in one flat unbroken curtain instead of separate drips. "Instruments break," he said. "Eyes don't." It was during those long work days that the underlined sentence from 1978 finally opened all the way up. And Nora understood exactly what her family owned, and exactly what Dale Perrault's $23,000 would actually buy. The Hollow's other sugar stands, the few still tapped, sat low and south-facing, close to the roads where the gathering was easy. Warm ground, early springs, early seasons. Her grandfather's line climbed a north slope under a tall, closed canopy, 500 feet higher, and a world colder, where snow lay in blue shade until April and the nights kept freezing long after the valley floor had given it up, which meant her trees woke later, ran later, and kept running after every low stand in the county had budded out and quit. Slope is worth more than sugar content. Emile hadn't been keeping a diary all those years. He had been documenting an asset, the one thing the Deschamps farm owned that no neighbor could copy and no market could crash. When she laid it all out for Alcide, half expecting to be corrected, he looked at her for a long moment with something that on a less weathered face might have been a smile. "Now you've read the whole ledger," he said. Then January of 1999 arrived and knocked the props out one at a time. The milk check dropped again, hard enough that Claudine's Thursday shoulders told the whole story from across the room. Dale Perrault telephoned, polite as ever, to remind Remy that the timber offer ran out at the end of the winter, and that maple veneer prices being what they were, he could even sharpen the number a little. And on the 11th of the month, Alcide Rousseau stepped out to his woodpile, found the one patch of dooryard ice his broom had missed in 30 years, and went down on his hip. Cracked, not shattered, the doctors said, as though that were good news, from the hospital bed. And then from a chair by his own stove, he made it clear in 4 words that he would not be climbing any north slope that spring. Whatever happened in the shack would happen on her hands alone. The co-op doc had its view on the situation, and for once said it with more pity than sport. A hurt old man and a girl not old enough to drive after dark, running near 200 buckets on a hillside. That was the winter even people who wished her well started wishing it more quietly. The kitchen table conversation happened on the last Sunday of January, and it was short, because the Deschamps family did not hold long ones. Remy laid Perriot's card on the table and said the number out loud for the first time, and what it would fix, and how long the list was of things it would fix. Nora did not cry and did not raise her voice, because she had learned her arguing style from a ledger. She went and got the notebook. She showed him the 14 gallons and what they had sold for, the 183 trees chalked and mapped, the 6 cords dry under steel, and the 9 days from 1978, underlined twice by his own father. "A check spends once," she said. "The hill pays every spring, and it has been paying since 1946, and the only years it missed were the years nobody asked it." Then she asked him for 1 season. Remy looked at the card, and at the notebook, and at his daughter, and he did not sign anything, and he did not promise anything either. "Ice goes out," he said finally. "We'll talk to the man." It was not a yes, it was a starting gun. She tapped a 183 trees the first week of March 1999. On the schedule, the notebook had built out of the previous year's scar tissue, and this time the holes were fresh and bright when the first true runs came. For 5 days the season behaved. Buckets rang, the tank traveled the sled roads, the pan threw steam through the cupola, and the first pulls came off the scoop in that flat amber curtain, while the hydrometer stem rode the red line like it was pleased to be back at work. Then, on the 8th of March, the weather did the cruelest thing Vermont weather knows how to do. It turned kind. A soft southern warmth slid up the valley and parked there, 60 degrees by noon, nights sagging just above freezing, day after day after day, and it did not leave. On the valley floor, the swing that drives the saps simply stopped. No freeze, no pull. The low south-facing stands went from ringing to dripping to silent inside of 4 days, and the trees, fooled towards spring, began the slow slide toward budding, after which the sap turns and no fire in the county can make syrup of it. By the 15th, every sugar shack in Corbeau County had banked its fires. Men stood on the co-op dock in shirt sleeves, talking about the season the way you talk about a hard funeral. And they were not wrong to. For most of them it had lasted 9 days. 500 feet up the Deschamps north slope, under the old closed canopy, the snowpack lay deep in blue, and the nights kept doing their work. 29 degrees, 27, 31, and holding. The freeze lived on that hill for 11 days after it died in the valley, exactly as a pencil line from 1978 said it could. And Nora Deschamps was there for every hour of it. She milked at 4:30, hauled sap till the school bus, hauled again till dark, boiled till midnight, slept 4 hours, and did it again. On the 4th night, headlights came up the sled road, and it was Luke, who had never once set foot in the shack, backing the flatbed around to the tank without being asked. He didn't explain himself, being a Deschamps. He picked up the gathering pails and said, "You'll want to eat something," and that was the whole conversation. And after that, there were 2 of them on the hill. One night near the end of it, alone at the arch while Luke ran a load down, she held a scoopful up to the lantern and watched the syrup let go of the steel in one unbroken amber sheet, and she stood absolutely still, a good deal longer than the test required. Her grandfather had stood on that exact spot of floor, watching that exact thing, before her father was born. The steam rolled under the roof boards. The fire ticked. Somewhere out in the dark, 200 buckets were quietly proving a dead man right. She drew her last pull on the 30th of March and bottled the crop through the first week of April. 52 gallons, finished and filtered. In a county where men with 3 times her taps had made 1/3 of their normal syrup. She entered the number in Emil's ledger, in pencil, directly beneath his final season, and dated it, and if her handwriting was more careful on that line than anywhere else in the book, nobody could blame her. Word travels fast in a place where nothing else is moving. It was Orville Stack who came first, which surprised everybody in the hollow except Alcidi. He drove up the farm lane on a Saturday with an empty half-gallon jar riding the seat beside him, stood in the shack doorway a long moment looking at a wall of buckets he had once watched a girl haul away like a favor, and then set the jar on the arch rail. "Might be I owe your junk an apology," he said. Nora filled the jar and did not make him say anything more, and that mercy was probably why, the following week, when somebody down at the co-op started in about the luck of it, the fluke hill, the freak spring, it was Orville, of all the men on that dock, who cut it short. "Weren't luck," he said. "Girl, read the land. Rest of us read the road." As for the man whose opinion had started it all, she carried a jar to Alcidi's kitchen herself and told him the whole of it, the 11 days, the numbers, Luke, and the headlights. He turned the jar over in his shaking hands, held it up to the window light, and delivered the longest praise he ever gave anybody. "Emile would have drunk this," he said. The other verdict came quieter. In mid-April, when the ice went out, Nora Deschamps drove to the next county and met Dale Perriot, who was gracious about it. Being a man who bought standing timber for a living and understood that some of it stays standing, nobody in the family ever repeated what was said. But that evening, Remy came into the kitchen, took the business card off the windowsill where it had spent 15 months, and set the first quart of the new crop down on top of it, square in the middle of the table. And that was the Deschamps family's entire announcement on the subject. The syrup money didn't match the timber money. Everyone at that table could subtract. But a check spends once. And by the following spring, the arithmetic had already begun to move, because 3 farms in the hollow, 2 of them with north slopes, nobody had tapped in a generation, asked Nora to walk their backwoods and tell them what they were sitting on. She took them on shares, the old way, the sugar-maker's percentage that had once paid men like Alcidi Rousseau, who now spent boil nights installed in a chair by her arched door, supervising by ear, complaining about her firing rate with visible contentment while his hands lay quiet in his lap. Her father stopped calling it her project and started calling it the sugar money, which in a farmhouse is a promotion. Claudine's Thursday shoulders eased, not all the way, but some. And around Bellamy Hollow the word junk quietly changed sides, because it was hard to say it with the old sneer once the whole valley had watched 217 rusted buckets outlast every shining operation on the road. The trees had been there the entire time, holding their cold and their sugar and their patience through 17 silent years. They were never the ones who quit. That was the sentence written inside the front cover of her notebook, in a teenager's handwriting, under an old man's words, and by then half the county could have recited it. Trees don't quit on people. People quit on trees. I keep coming back to that pencil line from 1978, underlined twice by a man who had no way of knowing who would someday need it. We spend so much of our attention mourning what's gone that we walk right past what has merely been set down, still whole, still working, waiting on a pair of patient hands. And I wonder now how much of what we call an inheritance is really land or money at all. Maybe the truest thing one generation leaves another is its recorded attention, the quiet proof that a thing can be done, sitting in a tin box until somebody stubborn enough comes along to read it. Most valleys have a box like that somewhere. Most of us never open the lid. This story is true to life fiction. All names, characters, places, and businesses are creative inventions, and any resemblance to real persons, farms, or events is coincidental. If you've ever brought an old piece of land, a trade, or a family skill back from the edge, or if somebody once called your best idea junk, tell us about it in the comments. We read every one of them. And if this story earned its keep tonight, subscribe and pass it along to somebody who still believes in patient work. There are more hollows where this one came from.